to today's Gem Shop Talk. Today I want to talk about the beauty of wood imperfections. You could think of wood as a bundle of straws. As a tree grows, it pulls moisture from the roots to the leaves. And those fibers is what pulls that moisture from the ground to the leaves. But when that log is cut, those fibers then begin to dry out. In fact, a sawmill will purposely dry the wood to a particular percentage of moisture in the wood. The drier the piece of wood, the less it weighs, and also the stronger the fibers. They'll use a moisture meter, something like this, and so when they will check a piece of wood, you can see in this particular case, this particular piece of maple is 8.7% moisture. And so they'll get it within a particular range in order for it to be useful in construction. Wood, because it has that moisture in its fibers, is constantly moving, expanding or contracting, depending upon the seasons of the year. The wetter the moisture in the air, the more that wood expands. The drier the air, the more that wood will contract. In fact, those who study it say that a board will expand or contract, you can say about 2 percentage points of the width. So this board, as it expands and contracts, moves. And because of that movement and the stresses in the fibers as the tree grew, it will do a number of things to that board. For instance, notice in this picture, you'll see the picture it can cup, it can bow, it can twist, it can crook, or can crack or check. The next thing I'd like to talk to you about is actually the grain of a board. This is some poplar, beautiful green hue to it. You can see some of that grain, but probably what you're most used to is pine. Pine has a very distinctive look of grain and a lot of knots in it. Other boards have less apparent grain. Cherry is a much tighter grain. Soft maple, you can see certainly the grain of the board. The wood that I generally use is oak. And you will get different looks of grain depending on how that board was cut from the log. Notice in this picture, you will see that depending on how the shape of the log, the size of the log will give you different cuts. And they will maximize the number of board feet out of the log by the way they cut it. Let me give you an example. Here you see the growth rings of the tree. This is red oak. As that tree grows, it will add a ring a year. Depending on how they cut this board from the log, you will either have flat sawn or rift sawn. Here's an example of a board that was cut in a particular way that shows a lot of the flecking. White oak has a lot of flecking, and it's really, once it's finished, and it's really, really beautiful. And so the way they cut the wood from the log depends on the beauty of the grain, but also the cost. Quarter sawn, it takes more of the log to do a quarter sawn cut than it does some of these other cuts. In this picture, I want to show you about the hardness of wood. As you can see in the different scales, each kinds of wood has a particular hardness of the board. It's called a Jenka scale or a Jenka value. Let me show you what I mean. In order to get a Jenka value, what they do is they take about a half-inch ball, 0.444 of an inch, and they will take that ball and they will press it into the wood halfway into the wood. The amount of pressure it takes to push that steel ball into the wood gives a numeric value. So they can compare one hardness of a board to the hardness of another board. For instance, in this board, this poplar, it has a Jenka value of 540. In yellow pine, it has a Jenka scale of 690. A lot of people use cherry. Cherry here, not too pretty, but once you plane it, a beautiful board. Cherry has a Jenka value of 950, as does soft maple. Oak is what I generally use. Oak has a Jenka value of 1290, whereas white oak has a Jenka value of 360. So why is that important? Well, if I was going to build a piece of furniture, I might want to use yellow pine. It's less expensive, it's easy to work, but I know that it won't be as durable as if I build something, let's say, out of oak. Oak, because it's harder to work with, but the end result is a more stable, sturdier piece. The next thing I want to talk about is the imperfections of wood. Here's a piece of maple. As you can see, it has a pretty ugly knot on it. I actually cut this knot out because in this case, the knot wouldn't add value to the piece. It would create a place that really would not be sturdy. So in this case, I cut the knot out. But a master designer might actually use the knots and the imperfections in the wood to his or her design element. For instance, here's a board, piece of red oak. This particular red oak board came out of Mississippi. I went and got the tree, brought the tree back to the sawmill here in Texas. It was cut. I stacked the lumber for 2 years, let it air dry. And then, as you can see, it's really not very pretty. But if you plane it, suddenly you can see that there's a lot of beauty. Here's the knots. Now I want you to see these black elements in the wood. This is called spalting. Spalting is caused by fungus that gets into the wood. It gives, in this case, some coloration to the wood. If you'll come to my study, I'll show you how I use these design elements in the design of some panel doors. But you can see this grain pattern here, really pretty simple. Certainly you can see the large grain, which is very reflective of red oak. But here's what I want to show you. Here is a door that I actually incorporated the knots and the spalting within the wood. Same way in this board. When I found these boards, I thought they were absolutely beautiful. And so I incorporated those knots designs intentionally into the door. And I think it certainly adds to the beauty of the door. Here's another example, just a cross that I made. And here you can see the discoloration caused by fungus and things within the wood. And I used it intentionally to show those imperfections. But I think the imperfections of the knots and the spalting and the twist and turn of the wood and the grain actually, to me, adds a great sense of beauty to the design. So what is a shop talk for today? I'm so glad that the master designer chose to use imperfect people to impact the world. In Luke chapter 6, he defines the 12 apostles. You know them: Simon Peter, James and John, Andrew, Bartholomew, Thomas. These 12 men were a motley crew. Imperfect they were, hot-headed, tax collector, activists, and yet God chose these very imperfect people to literally change the world. As a master designer of furniture, you get to choose whether or not to use the imperfections of wood to make something of beauty. And I find that God uses our imperfections, the knots, the twists, the contortions, and yes, even the dark stains of our lives. He takes his processes, and over time he will work our lives, and he creates something of great beauty. I'm grateful that God chooses to use us, imperfect as we are. And if we will yield ourselves to the master designer, he can take something pretty rough and turn it into something of great beauty. I want to challenge you to allow the master designer to use his processes in your life, turning a rough, old, useless board into something that only he can create. Thank you very much.